We have now the privilege to talk to David Smick. He is the chairman and CEO of the financial advisory firm Johnson Smick International in Washington, and also the author of the best-selling book The World is Carved, Hidden Dangers to the Global Economy, which is a very insightful analysis of the present situation in global finance. Mr. Smick, there is a growing number of experts, including the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Ben Bernanke, just this week, who expect that we will see the first signs of economic recovery this year already. Do you agree with that?
I think we're going to see a pickup, maybe sooner than Bernanke is saying, in the second quarter. My problem and worry is that there's a double dip scenario in the sense that, U.S. inventories are very low now, so we'll see an inventory cyclical pickup, and we'll see some of the Obama fiscal stimulus. But we could by the end of the year back to a very sluggish economy, and I'm worried about the effect that has on U.S. consumers who are already beat down and suddenly have some sign of hope, but it's not sustainable because the U.S. consumer is it's facing a huge loss in income. So we could end up with a scenario by December where the administration is having to go for a second fiscal stimulus, even though we saw a little bit of a pickup earlier in the year.
Let's talk about the fundamentals of this crisis. Much of it was caused by massive over-leverage in the credit system and excessive debt. Now governments try to fight the crisis with even more debt. How does this work?
Well, I think the crisis was resulted from too much leverage, but it also resulted from a lack of trust in our financial architecture, that fancy paper that the banks were using to measure and deploy risk and deploy capital. And the whole idea of mountains of paper in the form of mortgage-backed securities that the banks really didn't know the value of this stuff. I think ultimately it was a lack of transparency, of belief in the system. When you get down to it, the word liquidity, we all want liquidity in the economy. Liquidity comes down to one word: confidence. If you have confidence, liquidity appears, and I think today the global economy lacks the confidence. It's gaining some of it back, but ultimately it comes to, do we trust the financial instruments that our banks use to measure risk and deploy capital, and we're not there yet.
What is needed to restore confidence and transparency in the long run in the financial system?
I think we need a new financial doctrine for the world that defines the parameters of banking. I don't think we should be in a situation where the goal is to punish the banks, even though they need punishment. I think the goal is to figure out what the new system is, because ultimately we've got to get capital to people who create jobs. And the system that I see right now is basically risk averse. We are moving from an era of reckless financial risk-taking to a new era that may be even more dangerous, no financial risk-taking. And if we don't have financial risk-taking, then those who, particularly the business startup and the innovative sectors of our economy, if they can't find financing, then we're all going to suffer. So my concern is that we have financial reforms, restructuring, we recapitalize the banks in a way that keeps our eye on the ball. The goal now is a financial system that deploys capital for jobs.
Another major issue are the huge macroeconomic imbalances, especially between Asia and the US. How can these imbalances be removed? Have they to be removed? And how does this affect the US economy in the long run?
Well, when I look at the G20, which the heads of state and they meet, I think they talk around the key issues. They talk about the need for financial regulation. Well, that's important. But what we're seeing now is a crash landing in the global model under which the world has operated for the last 2 decades. Now, what was that model? It basically had most of the world, particularly emerging markets like China, but also some of the industrialized countries like Germany, operating large export engines. Exports were the dominant factor in their economy. And the idea was to export to the U.S. with the American consumer, this gluttonous American consumer, the consumer of last resort. The American consumer now is in hiding. I mean, the American consumer, the propensity to consume is going to remain very low. American consumer is not going to be there. And so where does that leave large parts of the world that are desperately dependent on exports? it leads that they're in a position where they need to quickly stimulate their economies and try to make the transition as soon as possible into consuming economies themselves. And that's going to be very difficult. I mean, it's not going to happen in China overnight. It could take a decade. And certainly very tough with aging populations to make them, rabid consumers, particularly aging, shrinking populations.
In your book, you also argue that about China, that China is going to be the next great bubble to burst. Why does China present a danger to the global economy? Because most people think that China would help the world economy to get back on its feet.
Well, we all want China to succeed. If China doesn't succeed, it's a huge problem for the rest of the world. I'm worried right now that China has, when I talk about a bubble, I'm not talking about a financial bubble or even an economic bubble. I'm talking about a social and political bubble. And I think if you look at the history of China since the Second World War, they've had 3 periods of social unrest. The Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution, and Tiananmen Square, and they all involved the previous year or year and a half of plummeting economic growth. And that stirred up huge social anxiety. So what are we facing in China today? Growth is collapsing because global exports have collapsed, and China's 40% of its economy is dependent on exports. So China now is desperately trying to stimulate using huge infrastructure spending. And loans are just plentiful in China, particularly in the rural community. And I hope it works. But the question I have is, can we believe the data coming out of China that shows things are a little more positive? I don't know. There's a lot of questions about that. But also, even if the data are correct, is this massive infrastructure spending sustainable? I mean, the Japanese in the 90s tried 10 fiscal packages to stimulate domestic demand. They had bridges to nowhere, roads to nowhere, bridges in the rural community. They did all the same kind of infrastructure spending, but it wasn't sustainable. Growth never really picked up, and I'm hoping that China is different, but I'm very questionable about it.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Smick, for your time. Thank you.